Britain entered the Second World War with an army still shaped by interwar economy and outdated doctrine, and left it fielding some of the most specialized armored vehicles ever put into combat. What British industry lacked in raw tank power for much of the war, it made up for in adaptation, turning ordinary chassis into flamethrowers, mine clearers, bridge layers, and amphibious tanks built to solve the exact problems standard vehicles couldn't. That adaptation extended beyond the battlefield itself. British factories, Canadian production lines, and American Lend-Lease shipments all fed the same war machine, so that a British armored division on the day of D-Day might advance behind a mix of home-built tanks, Canadian-hulled self-propelled guns, and American trucks, all working as one system. This is the major British and Commonwealth vehicle fleet of World War II. From the light tanks outmatched in France, to the specialized armor that helped open the beaches of Normandy. We start with the tanks Britain had when the war began, light tanks. Vickers Make-6. The Vickers Make-6 was Britain's standard light tank when the war started, armed only with machine guns and built for reconnaissance rather than combat against other armor. It fought in France in 1940 and early in the North African campaign, but against anything carrying a real gun, it was already outclassed before it arrived. Tetrarch. The Tetrarch carried a proper 2-pounder gun despite its light weight, and its defining feature was how it got to the battlefield. Small enough to be carried inside a Hamilcar glider, a handful supported British airborne troops on D-Day, giving glider infantry armor support they otherwise would have lacked entirely. Light tanks scouted ahead, but the main armored punch came from two very different families of British tank, cruisers built for speed, and infantry tanks built to survive. Cruiser tanks. Cruiser Mk3/Mk4. The Cruiser Mk3 and its improved successor, the Mk4, brought Christie suspension into British service, giving cruiser tanks genuinely useful cross-country speed for the first time. They fought in France in 1940 and in the early North African campaign, where that speed advantage mattered more than their thin armor and modest 2-pounder gun could make up for. Covenanter. The Covenanter was built for speed, but crippled by a cooling system that never worked reliably in combat conditions. It never saw action overseas because of those persistent overheating problems, spending its entire service life training crews in Britain while better cruiser tanks took its place in the field. Crusader. The Crusader became the main British cruiser tank in North Africa, valued for its speed but limited by a 2-pounder gun that struggled against German armor and by mechanical reliability that never matched American designs. Crews leaned on its mobility to outmaneuver threats they couldn't outgun. Cromwell. The Cromwell finally gave British cruiser tanks a genuinely strong engine and a 75 mm gun capable of real damage, entering service in time for the Normandy campaign. It was the first British tank built around the Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, and its speed let it keep pace with fast-moving operations even though its armor still lagged behind the heaviest German tanks it met. Comet. The Comet arrived in the final stretch of the war and is often considered the strongest cruiser tank Britain fielded, pairing Cromwell-level speed with a more powerful high-velocity 77 mm gun. It reached frontline units only months before the war ended, but it showed how far the cruiser tank line had come from the Mk3. Sherman Firefly. The Firefly took the American-built Sherman, supplied to Britain in large numbers through Lend-Lease, and rearmed it with the British 17-pounder, the only Allied tank gun in Western Europe reliably capable of killing a Panther or Tiger at normal combat ranges. Because the conversion was complex and production limited, Fireflies were typically spread thinly among troops of standard Shermans rather than fielded as complete units. But their presence alone changed how German tank crews approached an engagement. Cruiser tanks moved fast and hit hard when they could. Infantry tanks took the opposite approach entirely. Infantry tanks. Matilda I. The Matilda I was Britain's first dedicated infantry tank, built around thick armor for its era but armed with nothing more than a single machine gun. It reflected the tank doctrine of the 1930s rather than the war it was about to fight, and it was already obsolete by the time France fell in 1940. Matilda II. The Matilda II carried armor thick enough that German anti-tank guns in the early desert campaign struggled to penetrate it, earning it the nickname Queen of the Desert. It was slow, and its 2-pounder gun lacked a useful high-explosive shell. but for a stretch of the North African War it was nearly impossible for German forces to knock out. Valentine. The Valentine traded the Matilda's heavy armor for a smaller, more reliable, and far cheaper design that British factories could build in large numbers. More of them were produced than any other British tank of the war. Its dependability made it a favorite for export as well as home service, with thousands shipped to Soviet forces through Lend-Lease, and its chassis went on to form the basis of several British self-propelled guns. Churchill. The Churchill was built to survive trench-like conditions with heavy armor and the ability to climb terrain other tanks couldn't manage. Early versions were underarmed and exposed at Dieppe in 1942, but later marks carried stronger guns, and in Italy some Churchills were rear-armed in the field as the NA-75, fitted with 75 mm guns taken from knocked-out Shermans to give them a useful high-explosive shell. The hull's toughness ultimately made it the foundation for some of the war's most specialized armored vehicles. Standard tanks fought other tanks, but some battlefield problems needed a gun that didn't come standard at all. Self-propelled guns and tank destroyers. Bishop. The Bishop mounted a 25-pounder field gun in a tall, boxy superstructure on a Valentine chassis, giving artillery a way to move with advancing armor. Its high profile made it an easy target and severely limited the gun's elevation, and it was replaced fairly quickly by a more practical design. Sexton. The Sexton corrected the Bishop's problems by mounting the same 25-pounder gun on a Canadian Ram-based chassis with a lower, more practical layout. It became the standard self-propelled artillery piece for British and Canadian armored divisions for the rest of the war. Deacon. The Deacon solved a narrower problem in the Western Desert: how to give a 6-pounder anti-tank gun the mobility to keep up with fast-moving armored columns. The gun was mounted high in an open armored body on an AEC Matador truck chassis, and while it gave useful mobile firepower against tanks and armored cars for a time, it was withdrawn once purpose-built self-propelled guns became available. Achilles. The Achilles took the American M10 Wolverine and replaced its gun with the British 17-pounder, giving it far greater ability to defeat heavily armored German tanks at range. The upgrade turned a solid but limited American design into one of the more capable Allied tank destroyers in Europe. Archer. The Archer mounted a 17-pounder gun on a Valentine chassis facing toward the rear of the vehicle, an unusual choice that let crews fire and then drive straight back into cover without turning around. It sacrificed a conventional layout for a faster escape after every shot. Churchill gun carrier. The Churchill gun carrier mounted a 3-inch gun in a fixed, turretless casemate on a Churchill hull, designed as a heavy tank destroyer for home defense during the invasion scare of 1941. By the time it was ready, the threat it was built for had largely passed, and only a small number were built, with most never seeing significant combat. Some problems on the battlefield weren't about firepower at all. They were about getting past obstacles no ordinary tank could clear. Specialist armor. Sherman Crab. The Sherman Crab fitted a rotating drum of chains to the front of a standard Sherman, beating the ground ahead of it to detonate mines before the tank ever reached them. It let armored columns punch through minefields that would have otherwise stopped an advance cold. Churchill Crocodile. The Churchill Crocodile replaced its hull machine gun with a flamethrower fed by an armored trailer towed behind the tank, giving assault forces a way to clear bunkers and fortified positions at close range without exposing infantry to the fire needed to do it. Its psychological effect on defenders facing it was often as significant as the flame itself. Churchill AVRE. The Churchill AVRE, Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, replaced its main gun with the Petard, a short-range spigot mortar that fired a heavy demolition charge nicknamed the Flying Dustbin, built to destroy concrete obstacles and bunkers with a single round. Fitted with various attachments, it became the toolkit vehicle for engineers clearing the way through beach defenses on D-Day. Churchill Arc. The Churchill Arc stripped away the turret entirely and replaced it with folding ramps at each end, turning the tank itself into a bridge that other vehicles could drive straight over. It let armored columns cross gaps, walls, and obstacles that would otherwise have stopped an advance while under fire. Churchill Bobbin. The Churchill Bobbin carried a huge reel of canvas and wooden matting that it unrolled directly in front of itself as it advanced, laying an instant path over soft or unstable ground. It proved especially valuable on the loose sand and clay of the D-Day beaches, where wheeled and tracked vehicles alike risked becoming stuck. Churchill Fascine. The Churchill Fascine carried a large bundle of bound brushwood on its hull that could be dropped into a ditch or anti-tank trap to create an instant crossing point. It was a simple, low-tech solution to a problem that could otherwise stop an entire column in its tracks. Sherman DD. Duplex drive. The Sherman DD used a folding canvas screen and twin propellers to let a standard tank swim ashore under its own power before dropping the screen and fighting as a normal Sherman. It was meant to give assault troops armor support from the moment they hit the beach, though rough seas on D-Day sank a number of them before they reached land. These specialized tanks solved specific battlefield problems. Reconnaissance needed something else entirely. Vehicles built to see without being seen. Armored cars and scout vehicles. Daimler armored car. The Daimler armored car combined four-wheel drive with independent suspension on all wheels, giving it a smoother, more reliable ride over rough terrain than most armored cars of the era. Its 2-pounder gun gave it enough bite to handle light opposition, while its speed kept it out of serious fights. Guy armored car. The Guy armored car was among the first British armored cars built in real numbers once the war began, developed to replace the aging designs Britain had relied on through the 1930s. Production constraints meant it was soon succeeded by a very similar design built by Humber. But the Guy had already established the layout that series would refine. Humber armored car. The Humber armored car became one of the most widely produced British armored cars of the war, built across several marques with steadily improving armament. Its reliability and availability in large numbers made it a mainstay of reconnaissance units across every theater Britain fought in. Lanchester 6x4 armored car. The Lanchester was already an old design by the time the war started, tracing its roots back to the 1920s. It nonetheless remained in service into the early war years, most notably in the Far East, where it handled convoy escort and patrol duties in Malaya and Singapore. AEC armored car. The AEC armored car was built on the same Matador chassis as the artillery tractor of the same name, giving it a heavier build than most of its counterparts. Later marques mounted guns as large as a 75 mm, firepower that let it fight rather than simply flee when it ran into enemy armor, at the cost of the speed and agility lighter armored cars relied on. Standard Beaverette. The Beaverette was built in 1940 out of necessity rather than design ambition. An improvised armored car bolted onto a standard civilian car chassis during the invasion scare that followed the fall of France. It offered only modest protection, and was intended purely for home defense, never meant for frontline combat overseas. Daimler Dingo. The Daimler Dingo was a small, low scout car built purely for reconnaissance and liaison work, prized for how quietly and quickly it could move without drawing attention. Its size made it easy to hide and hard to hit, exactly what a vehicle built to observe rather than fight needed. Humber Scout Car. The Humber Scout Car filled the same role as the Dingo but in a larger body, trading some of the Daimler's agility for more interior space and better crew comfort. It served alongside the Dingo rather than replacing it, giving reconnaissance units a slightly heavier option. Humber Light Reconnaissance Car. The Humber Light Reconnaissance Car was built specifically for patrol and liaison work just behind the front lines, carrying a crew of 2 with only light protection. It was never intended to fight, only to see and report. Morris Light Reconnaissance Car. The Morris Light Reconnaissance Car served the same scouting role early in the war, recognizable for its sharply angled armor and open-topped fighting compartment. It saw wide use in the early North African and Italian campaigns before more modern designs took over. Armored cars scouted ahead on wheels. For infantry moving with the tanks themselves, Britain relied on something smaller and far more common: carriers. Universal carrier. The universal carrier, often called the Bren gun carrier, was a small, open-topped tracked vehicle built to move a machine gun team, a mortar crew, or general supplies wherever infantry needed them, keeping pace with advancing troops across rough ground. It carried almost no armor and offered little real protection, but its light weight and mechanical simplicity let Britain build it in numbers few other armored vehicles of the war could match. Wasp. The Wasp took the same universal carrier hull and fitted it with a Ronson flamethrower in place of its usual armament, giving infantry a mobile, close support weapon for clearing bunkers and fortified positions. Its small size let it work its way into positions a larger flame tank like the Crocodile couldn't reach. Lloyd carrier. The Lloyd carrier used a different chassis and engine layout from the Universal carrier and was mainly built as a gun tow vehicle, hauling weapons like the 6-pounder anti-tank gun into position. Its added power made it a dependable workhorse wherever guns needed to move quickly. Windsor carrier. The Windsor carrier was a Canadian-built, lengthened version of the Universal carrier, stretched to increase its load capacity and improve its cross-country performance. It gave Commonwealth forces a heavier lift option built on a hull crews already knew how to maintain. Carriers moved infantry support across land. Getting troops and supplies across water required a different kind of vehicle again. Amphibious vehicles. DUKW. The DUKW was an American design supplied to British forces through Lend-Lease, a 6-wheeled amphibious truck that could load from a ship offshore and drive straight onto the beach and inland without transferring cargo to smaller landing craft. British units used it heavily during the Normandy landings to keep supplies moving across beaches with no functioning harbor. Buffalo, LVT. Known in British service as the Buffalo, the American-built LVT gave assault troops a tracked vehicle that could swim ashore and keep crawling straight over beach obstacles that stopped wheeled landing craft. British and Commonwealth units used it in river crossings in Europe as well as amphibious landings, wherever water and land met under fire. Terrapin. The Terrapin was Britain's own amphibious cargo vehicle, built along similar lines to the DUKW but produced in far smaller numbers and generally considered less reliable in rough water. It saw limited use, largely overshadowed by the American vehicles Britain had access to through Lend-Lease. Amphibious vehicles solved the beach. Behind every landing, though, was an ordinary truck fleet that kept the whole army supplied. Trucks and utility vehicles. Bedford QL. The Bedford QL became the backbone of British Army logistics, a 4-wheel drive general service truck built in enormous numbers to haul troops, supplies, and equipment across every theater Britain fought in. Its dependability under hard use made it the vehicle most British soldiers actually depended on day-to-day. Bedford MW. The Bedford MW was the standard 1,500-weight truck of the war's early years, a smaller and simpler vehicle used for general duties and light cargo before heavier trucks took over the bulk of that work. Its rugged simplicity kept it in service across every early campaign. Bedford OY. The Bedford OY filled the 3-ton category, forming the majority of the British Army's supply line transport for most of the war. It lacked the QL's 4-wheel drive but made up for it in sheer numbers, moving the bulk of the Army's day-to-day cargo. Austin K5. The Austin K5 filled a similar general-purpose role to the Bedford trucks, used for cargo hauling and as a base for numerous specialized bodies, from workshops to fuel tankers, adding flexibility to the truck fleet supporting frontline units. Austin K2 Ambulance. The Austin K2, known to troops simply as the Caddy, became the standard British military ambulance of the war. Its tall, boxy body, instantly recognizable behind the lines. Built in large numbers, it carried wounded soldiers away from the front across every theater Britain fought in. Morris Commercial CS-8. The Morris Commercial CS-8 served as a 1,500-weight truck through the early years of the war, handling troop transport and light cargo before larger, more capable trucks took over the bulk of that work later in the conflict. Morris C-8 Quad. The Morris C-8, better known simply as the Quad, was built specifically to tow the 25-pounder field gun, Britain's standard artillery piece. Its 4-wheel drive and compact shape let it drag heavy guns across ground that would have stopped an ordinary truck. AEC Matador. The AEC Matador was a heavier artillery tractor built to tow Britain's largest field guns, including the 5.5-inch howitzer, work the smaller Quad simply wasn't built for. Its dependability made it one of the most trusted gun tractors in British service, and its chassis also formed the basis of the AEC armored car. Ford Bull EUAT-2. The Ford WAT-2 was a light 1,500-weight utility truck, built in large numbers under Britain's wartime truck program, handling much the same general duty role as the Bedford MW. Its simplicity made it easy to maintain wherever it served. Ford WAT-6. The Ford WAT-6 was a 3-ton 6-wheel drive truck, built for rougher going than most standard cargo trucks could manage. Its extra traction helped keep supplies moving over the broken terrain of the European campaign. Jeep. Lend-Lease. British forces received large numbers of American-built Jeeps through Lend-Lease, and the vehicle's lightweight and go-anywhere reliability made it just as valuable to British units as it was to the Americans who built it. Used for liaison, reconnaissance, and hauling everything from radios to wounded soldiers. Trucks moved the Army's supplies. Officers and commanders needed their own transport entirely. Staff vehicles. Humber Snipe. The Humber Snipe served as a staff car for British officers, based on a civilian saloon chassis, and adapted for military service with a rugged suspension suited to rougher roads than its civilian counterpart was designed for. Austin staff cars. Austin supplied several staff car models alongside Humber's offerings, giving senior officers reliable transport between headquarters well behind the front lines, painted and equipped for military rather than civilian use. Recovery and heavy vehicles. Scammell Pioneer. The Scammell Pioneer served as Britain's heavy recovery tractor, hauling disabled tanks and oversized loads much like its American counterpart, the Diamond T. Its rugged chassis and high torque made it one of the few vehicles capable of moving a fully loaded tank transporter over difficult terrain. Churchill ARV. The Churchill ARV stripped the turret from a standard Churchill hull and fitted a winch and crane in its place, giving recovery crews an armored vehicle tough enough to reach damaged tanks under fire and drag them back to safety. Motorcycles. BSA M20. The BSA M20 became the most widely used British military motorcycle of the war, valued for its simple, rugged design that kept it running under conditions that would have broken a more delicate machine. It carried dispatch riders and reconnaissance troops across every theater Britain fought in. Norton 16H. The Norton 16H served alongside the BSA M20 in similarly large numbers, handling the same courier and liaison duties from as early as 1937 through to the war's end. Its mechanical simplicity, shared with the BSA, made both machines easy to keep running with limited spare parts in the field. Matchless G3/L. The Matchless G3/L introduced telescopic front forks to British military motorcycles, a genuine improvement over the rigid forks of older designs. The better handling it offered made it a favorite among the riders who got to use one. Royal Enfield Flying Flea. The Flying Flea was built small and light enough to be dropped by parachute in its own container, giving airborne troops motorized transport the moment they landed. It let paratroopers move quickly once on the ground, without waiting for heavier vehicles to arrive by glider. Wellbike. The Wellbike went a step further than the Flying Flea, folding down small enough to fit inside a standard airborne supply canister. Built primarily for special forces and paratroopers, it traded range and comfort entirely for the ability to be dropped alongside the men who'd ride it. Closing. No single British vehicle carried the war on its own. The Churchill's toughness became the foundation for flame-throwing Crocodiles, bunker-busting AVREs, and bridge-laying Arcs. The Bedford Scammell and AEC gun tractors kept armor fueled, armed, and recovered. The Bren Carrier, the Dingo, and a whole family of light reconnaissance cars gave infantry and scouts a way to move that heavier vehicles couldn't match. And where British industry couldn't fill every gap, Lend-Lease Jeeps, DUKWs, Buffaloes, and Fireflies filled it instead. British victory depended on that same principle as every Allied force in the war, not one dominant machine, but an entire system of tanks, engineering vehicles, carriers, trucks, and Allied supplied equipment, built to adapt to whatever the battlefield demanded next.